All right. Well, thank you all for your patience with that. As I said, my name is Nolan Plesha. I'm one of the lobbyists for the League of Oregon Cities Government Relations team. Again, thank you all for being here tonight. I'm joined today by Jim McCauley, our legislative director, and your lobby team, Mark Garst, Ariel Nelson, Michael Martin, and Scott Winkles. I also want to take a moment to thank Melissa Deblo, our events and operations coordinator, for helping to pull this all together tonight. A couple quick reminders before we start. Please turn off your cameras and mute yourselves. This will limit any additional noise and distractions. If you have any questions, please send them in the chat at any time to Jim. You could just chat everyone. He will be collecting those and for the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. In order to make sure we cover everything and leave plenty of time for questions, we'll be walking through these slides fairly quickly. But please know that we are recording this webinar for members to watch at any time. We'll also be posting this PowerPoint separately and any additional documents for you all to look at. And lastly, our lobby team is always available if you have any questions at all. Our contact information will be on the final slide, but you can always find it at the LOC website under the About tab, Who We Are, and then the staff directory. So with that, let's get started. Next slide.
Hang on. It's not cooperating, is it?
So a quick overview for what we'll be covering today. Building relationships, drafting a concept or making a capital project ask, the legislative process, and lobbying tips for your bill or capital project asks. Next slide. One of the first pieces of advice we can give, in my opinion, and one of the most important, is building relationships ahead of time. This is challenging with new legislators and staff as there is very little time between them getting set up and the session getting started. However, your job will be made much easier if you have that relationship established. For returning legislators and staff, use the period between sessions to set up longer meetings. This can be a lunch, a cup of coffee, or even a simple walk. It's worth finding time to do this. If you have a chance to do it with staff as well, take it. I'll speak more on the staff shortly, but just know they are every bit as important as the legislator themselves. So I'll start with the obvious, and that is your legislators, House representatives, and your senators. These folks will be your advocates on the inside of the building. If you have a project ask or a policy concept, a good legislator will make sure it's on the radar of committee chairs, leadership, and the Ways and Means co-chairs. For policy, they will be your strongest advocates. Make sure you connect with them early and stay in touch with them throughout the entire process. Ask them what they need from you, provide them with updates, and work together to make sure you're increasing your chances of success. The second, and in my former staffer opinion, an equally important relationship is with staff. As many lobbyists and legislators know, staff run the building. They are the gatekeepers to your legislators. They read the emails, set up meetings, craft the concepts, and work with advocates and committee staff to ensure legislation and capital asks are on track. It will be worth your time to take a moment to meet with them individually. You can do this in person or virtually. Get to know them and be a local resource to your community for them. Be respectful to all staff, not just the chief of staff. If you're rude to their other staffers or the interns, you will start to lose your place in line for meeting requests and probably not receive the same level of support for your capital asks. They are the ones who often prioritize meetings, so always be respectful and patient with them. Respect their time and know how busy they will be during sessions. Don't be afraid to take a meeting with them if they can't get you in with your legislator. They are ultimately the ones who will run things and will be able to pass along information. Their bosses are busy and are limited in time, so be open to the options that they can provide. A first meeting with staff may get you a second meeting with the legislator. The last piece is your coalition partners. These may change depending on the policy or ask, and that is okay. But they can be key to building support for legislators and for you being successful. The larger the coalition, the better your odds will be. This is not 100% true, but having partners is always helpful. This may require compromises to gain support from unlikely places, so it can be tricky. However, it will improve your chances when you can bring people on board who are opposed to bring them or to bring them to a neutral position on your concepts. The less folks you have arguing against your concept, the better it will be for you. Next slide, please. Now that you have some relationships built, if you have not done so already, it's time to draft your concept. This is something you can start on your own or with a group. The first step is coming up with the idea. It's best to start well ahead of the session, and better yet, to have those conversations well ahead of September legislative days, when legislators are required to drop any bills they want introduced on the first day of session. This timeline may change from a long session to a short session, but the main point is that it is critical to have this done early to really increase your chances of success in session. I should note that by drafting the concept, this does not mean having all the language figured out. Details about what you are trying to achieve are important for your legislative champion, and we'll say more on that in a second, so that when legislative council drafts the bill, they have a better understanding of what you are trying to achieve. A quick tip here, it's always helpful to make sure the office you are working with requests a working draft before the draft is published into a legislative concept. This gives you and your team time to make sure the bill is heading in the right direction or to make changes to correct the course. It's not always necessary, but remember that the drafters are human and will take your concepts as they read it and try to draft it accordingly. A good office will see about setting up a meeting with the drafter ahead of drafting to talk the whole concept through. This helps them to better understand the concept ideas and to ask questions to make sure they understand what direction you are going in. This gets hard closer to session, so if possible, set this up in the summer, well ahead of the bill request deadline. Now, to finding a legislative champion. Ideally, this will be your legislator, but does not have to be. If you have a great housing proposal or a broadband proposal, find a legislator who champions those concepts and see if they'd be willing to support yours. I would always start with your own legislator as a courtesy, but do not be afraid to look elsewhere if they don't have the capacity or it's not in their usual bucket of issues. There are also strategic reasons to choose someone else than your own legislator. Build a coalition. I touched on this a bit previously, but the larger your coalition, especially with tough or controversial bills, the better chance you will have a success. It means more voices to talk to legislators, more people that have relationships with different legislators, and more pressure on leadership in the building. Once those steps are done, it's time to work your bill. Next slide, please. Once you have drafted your concept, your legislative champion will drop the bill with either the chief clerk on the House side or Secretary of Senate on the Senate side. They will then give it a bill number, HB for House bill or SB for a Senate bill. On the first day of session, the clerk and Senate president's offices respectively will perform a first reading for all the bills that were dropped in the chamber and ready before the bill drop deadline. This means they often read the bill number and brief relating to clause for every bill in that chamber. A quick note on what the relating to clause is for those that don't know. This clause basically outlines what can go in the bill and what cannot. And once the bill is official, it's the only piece of the bill that you cannot change with an amendment in session. As an example, if the relating to clause is related to energy, you cannot put things in the bill that's regarding beaver protection. That has nothing to do with energy, although perhaps someone here might be able to find a way to make that work. Moving on. Once completed, the Speaker and Senate President respectively will take each bill in their chamber and assign them to a committee. If you do your work in advance with your champion and the committee chair you wish your bill to go, There shouldn't be too many surprises of where and what committee your bill will be in. However, that is completely up to the presiding officers and how many bills need to go to any particular committee. A key piece of advice: do not wait until session to start lobbying your bill with the chairs. They love to have a heads up and will be able to help move a bill quicker when they know what has been going on with the concept. This is especially true in a short session where you have very little time to get your bill through. Once it's in committee, there are a few steps you will need to take. First, start connecting with the committee members to talk about your bill. Regardless if you have or have not, you should at the very least connect with the chair and the vice chairs or chairs of the committee. Some committees, especially in the House, have 2 vice chairs and 1 from each party. We'll get to the specific on lobbying tips later in the presentation, but for now, please know that when and whether you get a hearing for a bill will be determined by the chair. Chairs will often consult their vice chairs, so it's always good to make sure you've had a conversation with both people. They also always run their schedules by the presiding officer's offices to get final approval, so it never hurts to connect with their offices in advance. Those are the Speaker and the Senate President offices. Always make the ask about setting up a public hearing when you have a conversation with either the chairs or the presiding officer's offices. You don't need a specific date, but do make sure to ask. While you are having those conversations, and also before, you should start preparing for the public hearing and the work sessions. Next slide, please. Back one. Thank you. The public hearings. Coordinate with your legislative champion. They should request a public hearing from the chair, but coordinate with them on the ask. They can keep you in the loop and request your help for a formal ask. In some cases, you may need to be the one to ask yourself. Your LOC lobbyist can also help with this process. Identify key people to testify and make sure to have everyone sign up in advance. Avoid large groups if possible, and keep to the key targeted people or organizations that will really target the main points about the concept you need to get across and to challenge potential opposition arguments. If the opposition is arguing the concept is bad for counties, but counties are supportive, have a county person there to testify to the benefits of your bill. Sign up to testify and make sure everyone you want to testify is signed up. If you wish to testify on a bill in person, you will need to arrive at the Capitol early and line up at least 30 minutes prior to the hearing, especially for this upcoming session. We already know it's going to be a very challenging session, and we expect there are going to be daily caps on occupancy. So if you need to testify in person, please show up in advance. Normally there's a sign-in sheet outside, and you can also sign up online using OLIS, which is the Oregon Legislative Information System. Find your committee, select the date of the hearing, and there should be information to sign up there. So please do so in advance. Focus your testimony on the key points you need to make to the committee. An added story can be powerful to support your points, but keep your testimony short and to the point. Legislators really appreciate brevity. Testimony can usually be about 5 minutes, and in rare cases, even more. Always be prepared to condense your testimony down to 1 or 2 minutes if there is a packed agenda or a controversial bill. Submit additional or long testimony, one-pagers, articles, and any other supporting documents as written testimony in advance. There is no limit, and if you have trouble, work with your legislative champion's office to make sure stuff is uploaded. Best to do so as soon as you have a notice of a hearing so that you can work out any problems that you may have. You can always refer to these documents in your oral testimony to keep the spoken testimony short. As an example, my full testimony is online, but for the sake of time, I'll keep my testimony here short. Another way you could say is, I'll refer you to the one-pager on OLIS for detailed information on the program specifics. Next slide, please. For the work sessions, there's not much to do here, but prior to this, you want to make sure you have a vote count and that you have the votes you need to get it out of the committee. Your legislative champion can help with this, but you can do work by talking to each member in advance. Outside of this is whether or not your bill will pass a floor vote. Most committee chairs will not hold a work session if they know the bill will die on the floor. Again, your champion can help you figure out this vote count. It doesn't matter if your champion is in the majority or the minority party, there are always ways for them to help you figure out a path forward for your bill. As noted, a majority of the full committee is needed to pass a bill. In my former hat, there was a confusion for a bill that we were trying to pass. The committee voted on the bill with only 5 members present. 3 of them voted yes, and they thought the bill had passed. There were 7 members on the full committee, so the vote ultimately failed. Long story short, staff did figure out the mistake, and it was corrected by a procedural moves and some good grace by those who had voted no. Next slide, please. If passed out of committee, it moves to the floor. There are a couple of exceptions. If the bill must go through another committee or the Ways and Means committee, some bills have a revenue impact, so it must go through the Revenue Committee first. Others might have a fiscal or funding impact and therefore need to go through the Ways and Means Committee. Michael will talk about this briefly in a later slide. Others may need more work with their bill, and with deadlines coming up, it's often referred to committees that are not subject to the deadline rules, like the Rules Committee, Revenue, or their center counterpart, Finance and Revenue. Please note, any documents or testimony in previous committees would have to be reposted again for the second committee. The exception here is Ways and Means. Before final debate, the bill has to have a second reading. It's basically a notice that the bill will get a final reading and debate during the next floor session. The third reading is the final reading of the bill before debate and a vote. In usual times, rules are suspended early in session to just read the relating to clause of a bill, and they move quickly to debate. In the past few years, those rules have not always been suspended, and instead, they have been asked to read the whole bill word by word. That means it can take 15 minutes, 30 minutes, or sometimes even 8 hours to read a long bill before they are finally able to debate it. These are procedural moves to slow the process and often used by the minority party. Once read, the bill is debated and the chamber votes. Next slide, please. So next is the second chamber. And basically just repeat everything that you did in the first chamber. Everything that was said applies. And a couple quick but important notes. Documents and testimony do not transfer. If you posted documents in the House committee, you need to do so again on the Senate side and vice versa. Everyone who testified will need to do so again if they are able. Sometimes you can get away with less testimony in the second chamber due to limited time. If all the steps are completed and the second chamber passes the bill, it's signed by the Speaker and Senate President before it moves to the governor's desk for a final signature. Rarely when one party controls both chambers and the governor's office do you have to worry too much about a veto. It's not unheard of, but it's rare. In a divided government, which we don't have, this becomes something to be concerned about. However, regardless of the situation, the work you put in ahead of time is the most important signal of possible success. Getting sponsors, especially chief sponsors from both parties, and especially both chambers, really increases your chances. And one final note that I haven't mentioned yet, try your best to have a House champion and a Senate champion. If things start to go wrong in the second chamber, it's beneficial to have someone there who can speak to leadership and get your bill on track. It's also beneficial to have somebody in those caucus room spaces to advocate for your bill when you or your original champion are not allowed to be there. So next, I will turn it over to Michael to talk about the capital asks. Next slide, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Nolan, for teeing that up really well. So if we could go back to slide 10, it will tell you there's both the nuts and bolts of making your capital ask and the relationship component. And I'll reemphasize some things that Nolan said because they're very important. So to the who, your co-chairs of the Full Ways and Means Committee currently are Senator Elizabeth Steiner and Representative Tana Sanchez. And in the House Senate leadership, and these are all people that are important to have a relationship, not just with them, but also with their staff. So in the House Senate leadership, that's House Speaker Dan Rayfield and Senate President Rob Wagner. I think to emphasize again what Nolan said with always being respectful to staff is this isn't just important to building long-term relationships, but it really helps set the tone in the building and when we're discussing these complex issues and making budget asks as they're debated. So I think a good rule is, always be thoughtful in your actions and conduct yourself with class. You'll never regret either. It's really important to do this with both staff and legislators. And then the who of the co-chairs on the Capital Construction Committee, that would be currently Representative Paul Hovey and Senator Fred Gerard. These folks right now are current and most likely, but as you all know, there's a new group of legislators and a large new group of legislators. And so there'll be plenty of opportunity to build relationships with those folks, but these are the key leaders. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So really important when you're making your capital ask that you take time to know what you're prepared to testify in front of the Capital Construction Committee. And as you can see here on the slide, maximum of 3 people to testify on one project. Keep your remarks to 1 minute and focus on key points. Like Nolan said, can't emphasize this enough. The context in the legislative session is that they're hearing many of these things over and over again. So brevity is really helpful, and then highlighting those additional documents that you've provided. And third point here, provide details in a 1-pager. You can always reference that and keep it short and sweet. Legislators really love that. And then lastly, Nolan had talked about this, about really taking time on a capital ask to develop relationships with your legislators. You often want to start that in the summer before there is, the nuts and bolts. There's a capital project information form that is actually filled out by your legislator, your representative. But really taking the time to build those relationships early on is going to set yourself up for success when making a capital ask. And with that, hand it over to Scott.
Good evening. I'm happy to talk about some lobbying tips. Again, I'm Scott Winkles. I've been with the league for 16 years. I think I'm starting my 9th session with long session with the LOC. And I'll share a few of tips that we've picked up along the way. I think the first thing you need to understand about the Capitol is it is a very fast-paced environment. You're only going to have a few minutes, for 15 minutes on the calendar for a meeting. In all likelihood, that's going to get cut short. One of the challenges we are going into this session is that we have a very few staff in the building who have actually been through a long session with the building at full speed with everybody inside, and with some logistical considerations due to the construction. that the time pressure is going to be pretty significant. And so you're going to want to make the most of that time, and you also have to be flexible. And if you do get cut short, the best thing to do is to roll with it. A legislator is going to remember how you responded to that more than they're going to remember what you're talking about in that meeting. It's just people can't retain individual information on bills for years. Yeah, so again, stick to those main points. Make your points in a way that you would like. If somebody was going to go to your city council and lobby for something, do that. Do what you would want to hear from the public or from somebody within your community who is asking you to do something. They're going to respond to it. You don't need to be nervous. This isn't, they know you, they want to talk to you, they want to know about these bills. For the most part, you know, we have a few outliers, but for the most part, the legislator wants to hear from you, and they're going to want to know what you're looking for as well. You're there to help them, and they know that. Again, you know, over communicate, provide materials ahead of time. You want to have your emailed, your written materials to them before the meeting. Keep those concise and to the point as well. They're going to get skimmed, but they are going to get read. And then don't assume that they want paper copies. I know we have a lot of offices in the building who are, you know, trying to be paperless. I think we find Sasquatch before we find a truly paperless office in the Capitol, but it could happen. So again, have this stuff on electronic copies. You might want to, I mean, have your hard copies as well, but electronic as well. And then make your ask, and make your ask directly and expect a direct answer. Don't try to get distracted if they don't want to give you the right answer, or they want to equivocate, or they want to know, or they don't want to give an answer right away. You know, that's fine, but expect and make the expectation that they're going to let you know where they land on this bill and what you're asking them to do. You know, a lot of times if you're having a difficult conversation with a legislator, they're going to, you'll come in, they'll sit down, it'll be very friendly, and they'll ask you about, you know, the soda fountain at the corner of Main Street, and try to eat the clock that way before they can get to the business. Don't accept that. I mean, be polite, but always direct it back and expect them to be straight with you if you're straight with them. And the final thing, when you're finished, even if you're running out of time, always ask, is there anything we can do for you? They remember that. They'll probably take you up on it. And that's a great way to build that and cement that relationship if you have that sort of exchange, because they might have a bill that they're having a hard time getting to. Maybe it's important to us, maybe it's important to your community. You're not in the loop on. There's an opportunity to build. So always look for those opportunities and move on those. So with that, I will happy to take Q&A.
There you go. So I think at this point, the best thing to offer is to go ahead and use the chat function and start asking some questions. We can take a moment or two to see how that populates, but I think at this point, that's probably the best thing to do. We've got roughly another 25 minutes as part of this webinar. This is really your first introduction for those of you who haven't had a chance to do this in the past. We will follow this up with another level of lobbying that's really going to focus more on capital projects. We'll be doing it actually during City Day. And as mentioned earlier, this content will be up on LSC's website, specifically the Legislative Advocacy side. I think one thing I want to really stress for folks out there, and for anybody who's heard me in meetings before, that relationship building is incredibly important, not just to something specific that's important to your local community, but for your combined advocacy, for the league's work and our priorities that we focus in on during session. So keep that in mind, and also keep in mind is that relationship building isn't just during session. You have the opportunity, certainly during the interim, when these folks are doing community discussions, or perhaps see them at events or coffees that they may be doing in district. Certainly take them up on those opportunities, because that is an important component as well to help build on that relationship structure. So I'm going to take a quick look into the chat function to see what we've got so far. Okay, I'll start with a question from Peter Hall. What issues does the Capital Construction Committee deal with? Michael, do you want to take that? Michael, you step away.
I can jump in on that one, Jim, if you like. So capital construction typically deals with bonding projects. So it's bricks and mortar construction that the state's going to issue bonds for. The committee is also, it's kind of a euphemism. It's a leadership committee as well. It's made up of the presiding officers, of the president of the Senate, Speaker of the House, usually the caucus leaders from both chambers and both parties, and co-chairs occasion sometimes. And it's also a leadership committee. So if there's a bill that is hanging up the session where the sides are entrenched, or their leadership's gotten involved, then the bill could go there. So where the presiding officers really take some control over it. But mostly it's supposed to be a construction committee, but it does other things as assigned.
So effectively all state buildings, if they've got some type of new building going up, university system, et cetera, community colleges in some respects looking for some state matching dollars. Those are the types of things in there. I'm going to move up the line in some of the couple of questions too. Question over how many bills effectively legislators really get to prioritize. Question of whether or not it's 2 or 3, or if there's a larger percentage of that. So it's probably a little bit of a mix. Certainly for new legislators or legislators that are in, we'll say, very competitive districts, they're going to want to be able to show success to their constituent base. So it's somewhat reasonable to think that they're going to get some kind of a capital construction type project, something that has a community value out there, but also perhaps some policy bills as well. And I don't think it's necessarily combined to 2 or 3, but realistically, going into any session, as fast paced as it is, that really comes down to what kind of a bandwidth that legislator has and their ability to manage, whether it's 2 or 3 bills or 4 or 5. They also have their own coalition building that they do internally within the caucuses to try to get this to be a priority bill for the caucus. So that's part of that promotion or part of their advocacy they do internally.
Jim, can I add a few points here as well?
Yeah, please.
So a couple things, as veteran legislators, they tend to have a greater capacity. They tend to be able to run a lot more bills. You do have some legislators that sometimes will submit up to 100 concepts in a session. Granted, they're not going to really be able to get all those passed, but you have some legislators that will introduce a ton of bills. And then the reality is they will submit bills that they are not going to really be able to work themselves, and that instead the coalition is really going to work. So, sometimes legislator really have, up to maybe 5 priority bills that they are really going to be focused on and pushing. They'll have other bills that they really care about, but other folks will really take the lead in the lobbying effort and organizing the committees. And then that's just also where staff really come in. Sometimes they're really just shepherding their legislator along to testify for these bills, but they're doing all the background work. So I would also just note that new legislators, they often will really get about 2 to 3 bills maybe that they can prioritize. And it's just really hard to develop a concept before you come into your first session. So, really depends on the length of time the legislator's been there, their role in the legislature. And then lastly, chairs do have that extra ability that they can submit committee bills as well as their own personal bills. They often work with the committees on those committee bills. There's usually a fair amount of agreement, not always, but that essentially allows them to have additional bills. I guess I should also just put in a quick note that there is a very big difference between the amount of bills that they can introduce in a long session versus a short session. A short session, they tend to only have the ability to introduce 2 bills each. Sometimes in the past, the Senate has limited that to 1 bill per legislator, and then committee bills get 3 during a short session. So all those kind of factor into that, but hopefully that kind of sets the playing field there.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think just in terms of on the capital construction piece, because we mentioned you want to really start that conversation well in advance of the session occurring. I'm sure many of you have got new legislators, so they're under kind of a different, I'll say, calendar process at this point. So for those of you who have got a brand new legislator, and you've got some kind of a project that's local, as an example, I would start that conversation as quickly as possible so you can get that in front of them, because as Nolan mentioned, there may be an opportunity for those new folks coming on to be able to bring something back to their district of value. And we are looking at roughly 1/3 turnover between this session and the 2019 session, or 2021 session, excuse me. So there's a good sizable amount of brand new folks coming in to the session. I'm going to keep going down the list of at least questions or comments. Peter Hall made a comment in here about sometimes there are multiple sessions that it takes to move a bill. That is true. So if you at first don't succeed, certainly keep trying, because you might be surprised that if you can keep your foot on the gas pedal for something that's important from a policy standpoint or even from a capital construction, you may have to work it for 2 or 3 sessions. I know there are lobbyists certainly within my mix that have had multiple sessions. I had a pretty major bill that went through 4 sessions before finally found a window to move it through the process. So sometimes, our government doesn't exactly move swiftly, and then there's a reason for that. So sometimes you don't want them to move that swiftly. So this stuff can take time, finding the right, I'll say, special sauce to get that coalition together and get the advocacy right and identify a window of opportunity that's out there. Question from—
I would also add, Jim, you only have to win once.
That's right.
I mean, we've got bills, we've run several sessions, and eventually you get you get the opportunity and it goes through. I've got a few. We're going to try that this time. So,
right. And same here. So question from Sue Ryan Newberg, question about if meetings are happening in person, where are those taking place since the Capitol building is under construction? So the Capitol right now, and the anticipated what it's going to look like for session, is that the hallway where all of the hearing rooms are on the main floor, public will have access to that. There's going to be a limitation on building capacity. We're still trying to figure out exactly what that looks like, because we're getting mixed messages on the number, as well as how they're going to be monitoring it and what's going to happen if they hit that building capacity number. So there will be an opportunity for in-person hearing or in-person testimony in the hearing rooms that are there on the main floor. There'll be opportunities, of course, to meet with your legislator, because both wings, both on the Senate and House side, are open to be able to meet with. It's just a much more confined space is really what it comes down to at this point. And then the other thing too is we are hoping that they're going to continue on with a virtual meeting or virtual testimony option. I think that's one of the pieces that came out of the pandemic that has been helpful in this legislative process, is you don't have to drive 5 or 6 hours or longer to get to Salem and then find out that your hearing's been canceled, or that you're so far down the list, you're not going to get a chance to testify. So I think we're hopeful that they're going to continue to provide that virtual option and be able to at least keep getting input from around the state on some of the issues. Let's see. Okay. Here's a great question. This is something that Nolan brought up a bit, and that's really a question over multi-partner coalitions. What's the best way to prioritize who testifies? Our local elected officials at the top. So I'll let Nolan chime in here, but my experience is that if you've got the opportunity on whether it's a policy bill or even capital construction type of piece, I would have a panel set up. So in the capital construction, you've got 3. You're probably going to want to have an expert who's familiar with the project. You're going to want to have a local elected official advocating for it, and probably another person that is maybe impacted or presents some value that might not be an elected official. It could be some kind of a community action agency or something of that nature. If you're looking at those policy bills, you've got the ability to have a panel of, I'll say anywhere from 3 to 5 folks that would come up, and each of them have a particular role. In my mind, the elected officials are really helpful in that process because they are representing a constituent base that is the same as perhaps your elected official that might be sitting on the committee. So I think that's helpful. You're going to want to have some expertise on the panel who's really familiar. They can perhaps answer some detailed questions from the dais. And it's always helpful from time to time to also have your legislative champion with you on that panel to be able to make a case in front of the committee to their colleagues as well. So Nolan, I don't know if you've got something else to add.
Yeah, I think you actually did really well. I would try to think through as much as possible, like what are the oppositional arguments? Most of the time you'll have a fair sense of how the opposition is arguing against the bill. From that, you can sometimes think about like, okay, well, here is their argument saying that this is not really good, as my example earlier, not good for counties. So if you have counties that are supportive or know about it, have them testify, have them be the ones to counter that argument to show why this actually is good for counties. I think it's always helpful to really think through that, especially in the legislature. One of the things we really kind of focused on in my previous hat was making sure there are rural voices as well as urban voices, really kind of spread out the diversity of who is testifying to make sure you're capturing a wide range of voices in the committee. Like Jim said, it's important to try to keep these panels small. We really try to aim for maybe 6 people max. So two panels. Again, brevity is really the key to the game here, especially in a short session where you're trying to get through a lot of bills in a very short amount of time. Not having a lot of people up there to testify, they're take up a lot of time and really just annoy some of the legislators is going to be really helpful. But otherwise, like I said, I think Jim really kind of covered it. Having your legislative champion really lead off is really important for a lot of these. Like I mentioned earlier, some legislators aren't going to pay 100% attention to everything that's happening in the bill, but when it comes time for the public hearing, they can have a piece of testimony ready to stand up there for you and make a quick case before they turn it to the rest of the panel.
Yeah. One thing that Nolan mentioned early on was being prepared. And part of that preparation not only is making sure that you've got your narrative that's really short and tight, 2 or 3 points that you want to make, again, reference to the full testimony that's offered, or making sure that the other people who are on the panel pick up pieces of it. So essentially you are building a case, or I'll say a miniature campaign in front of the committee. You got to be also strategic about this. So if you've got folks on a particular policy bill who are sitting on the committee that you're in front of, that's something to think about too, is to make sure that they understand that they've got a constituent in front of them that's part of their district. That's always helpful as well in this process. And again, you do that with the meetings that you're having with committee members, so that when you get into that committee hearing process, you have, I'll say, less of a chance for surprised questions And you also have to anticipate what type of questions you're going to get, or at least be able to come back with answers. That's certainly something that Scott emphasized too in his comments, is that the quickest road to destroy your credibility is to basically BS somebody. If you don't know the answer, just say, look, I don't know the answer to this. I will get back to you with it. That is the easiest answer. Don't sit there and hem and haw and think about it and go, well, I'll take a guess. That's the worst possible response to a question.
Yeah, there are
okay,
a couple of
that's
lobby organizations in the building who they do this, and I adore it because we're usually at odds with them, but they'll portray that what they're asking for is a technical fix or a clarification, and then they'll pack the room with people in the same colored t-shirts, and legislators just don't buy that. So just stick to the basics, be concise, be factual, use your argument points, all that stuff we learned in speech 111 class. It works. So it's part of your strategic communication.
I just want to add a quick note. You never know when your public hearing is actually going to be. And sometimes things change. Sometimes it gets removed at the last moment and put on the following committee day. So sometimes you have to be very flexible, and folks who were able to make it one date may not be able to make it for the next. Again, that's where it's really important to make sure those folks are at least submitting their full testimony online. So again, you can always refer to it. Maybe you can have somebody else stand in to read the testimony for them. But just remember, you have to be flexible sometimes, especially again in a short session where there's not a lot of time and you have to be ready to go at pretty much a moment's notice.
There's a good question in the chat about again, just where do you start? If you've never done this before, you're passionate about a particular issue, but you're looking for some kind of guidance on how to really start. And for me, my experiences is ultimately comes down to, what are you trying to fix? And can you describe what you're trying to fix in, I'll just say, some type of concise form? And then if you can at least start with that, you can then come up with what are the options for making the fix. And then it's a matter of just kind of building an argument or a case for why you need to have a particular policy change. Or again, if you turn this into a capital construction, why is that water project important to the community? I mean, those are kind of the basics. Or what are you trying to fix, as an example? So you just have to break this down into really just the fundamentals of what you're trying, or what your passion is, and what you want to have at the end of the day. And have a level of patience in this process as well, because it's not clean, it's not easy to work through, and to think about potentially some baby steps. You may have a really giant, I'll just say, policy idea here that may take several sessions to be able to get to where you want, but you're going to need to be thinking about whether you're willing to take a step towards that, and to try to make some progress and try to look at it from that standpoint as well. Let's see here. So the question about where do you look to find out about your legislators? So right now, anybody who's new that's coming into the process, they will not have the legislative website, OLIS, up with all of the contact information until probably the second week of January. So the emails, the phone numbers, and things of that nature will be all present on OLIS. In advance of that, the option you have to email somebody if you don't have their numbers or don't have their contact information from when they were running for the office in the first place. It's a syntax. Help me out, Nolan. I've got a brain freeze on what it is.
Yeah, are you reading the question from Krista?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and I think one of the part of that is about, how can you find out what they can do for you, and so you're not wasting their time. As a staffer, I would just say ask. you would be surprised what they can do for you. And if there's not something they can do, they will be able to find who can. There are many times where we just refer people to our federal officials. Sometimes, and as a elected official, this won't always be helpful for you, but we would refer them back to a local official. And it really depends on what the case is. Really my rule of thumb is you're better off asking and seeing if there is a way for them to help, and just to have those conversations. And then again, if you're looking to figure out who your legislators are, you can go to the legislative website, and if you select whether it's the Senate or the House, there is a little tab that says find your legislator. You can input your address and it'll pull up a map of the state, zoom in on your address, and will tell you who your state senator is. You could change the tab to representatives. It will show you who your state representatives are. And then you can also select to find out who your congressional member is. But that's a great tool. I don't know how updated it is for the 23 session just yet, but that should be available fairly soon.
I've got my fingers that it's going to work, crossed anyway, on this process. So when you're communicating again with your legislators, all of their contact information will be up on OLS. For the folks who are new and you want to try to reach out to them right now before their regular Senate or House member emails are live in January, your option is basically send elect. So it'd be SENELECT, and then whatever the name of the person is, first, last, at OregonLegislature.gov. So it follows the same syntax with at OregonLegislature.gov as the normal one. It's just a matter of sticking in SENELECT or rep-elect. So REP elect, full name, at OregonLegislature.gov. Let's see here. Michael, thank you for sticking that in. It's in the chat if you're looking for the actual syntax on how this works. So just a quick time check, folks. We've got 2 minutes left. Happy to take any additional questions in chat. Okay. I am not seeing anything else. Nolan or Scott or Michael or anybody else from the team want to make any final comments?
I would just say, please utilize us as a resource. That's what we're here for. I put our emails in the chat. Earlier, I mentioned where to find them on the League of Cities websites. If you haven't already signed up for our bulletins, we try to put things in there that are very relevant to you all in ways you can be helpful. We'll also be sending out action alerts when we need folks' help on things throughout session. But again, please utilize this as a resource either before, during session. If you have bills you're working on and just need a little advice, that's what we're here for as a team. We're here for you. So again, don't hesitate to reach out to us. And
if you do have an interaction with a legislator and you do get an answer on a bill, particularly if it's one that the league, if it's a league bill where we've taken a position, and you'll see that on our bill tracker, let the lobbyist know. And if you don't know who the lobbyist is, just email one of us and we'll figure it out. But we always want to get that those reports back.
I also just quickly want to flag something that Sue put in the chat. During session, if you look up your bill, you can actually sign up to track your bill on OLS. It will send you alerts when your bill is scheduled for a public hearing, when it gets a work session, when it moves to a different chamber. I have always found that as a staffer to be incredibly helpful because you are tracking a lot of bills, and it's a great resource to utilize. So thank you for putting that up there, Sue.
Yeah. Final parting comment. Kind of started this off on when I first made my initial remarks. If you don't have a relationship with your state senator or state rep, get one. take them out for a cup of coffee. Find the time to make a call to them, reach out to them with email, introduce yourself, personalize the contact. Make sure they understand that your constituent base that you're representing is the same as their constituent base. I think the other part of this too is take advantage of the information that we put out on a weekly basis. And Nolan mentioned the bulletin. That's kind of what we live and breathe on in terms of up-to-date information on bills that are active or where we may need some help. We also send out direct communication and have the ability by district to let cities know within a specific Senate district or a House district that we need help. And it's always great to have that response. That grassroots level of lobbying that you're able to interact with has a tremendous effect and value for the work that we end up doing in Salem. I think the final piece here really comes down to a plug for City Day coming up January 25th. We've got a program in the morning where we'll have the governor, all the leadership members for both House and Senate caucuses in the morning talking about session. You'll get a briefing from your lobby team. And then in the afternoon, there'll be an opportunity for you to set up your own meetings with your own legislators and get some time to advocate or introduce yourself to them, as well as an opportunity that afternoon or that evening for some other programmed information for members, and then a reception that night for members as well as legislators and stuff. And it's it's a great opportunity on the front end of the session to get active in what will be, I will just say, a very interesting session going forward in 23. Keep in mind, we have got a new governor, we have new presiding officers, and we've got a substantial turnover of legislators from the 21 session that we're all going to have to kind of scramble and establish relationships with. So appreciate everybody's indulgence tonight. And I think with that, we'll go ahead and close this webinar. So thank you again very much for attending. Nolan, everybody on the team, awesome job.